Hey everyone, it's Andrew here again. So this week we'll be thinking about revision strategies. So we're coming up to the deadline for the research essay in the class, and one of the things that you should be doing at this point is preparing a first draft of the paper. Now, as we've discussed, and as some of the papers we've looked at mention, the first draft is the time to test out ideas. It is by no means a finished product, and you should not really treat it that way. It's in the revision phase where your essay goes from, or anything that you're writing really, goes from being a raw piece of work where thoughts may be underdeveloped or sentences may be unclear, that it becomes a well-organized, well-oiled machine, really. Now, for this particular class, I'm going to be talking about one kind of revision that I think is quite important, and that is revision for conciseness. This is where you try to make a paper as efficient as possible, so that each sentence, each paragraph, and each word is doing work. A perfectly concise paper is one in which not a single word could be changed without making the word worse. And the model that I like to use to think about this actually comes from poetry. So this is a classic poem by the American poet William Carlos Williams, The Red Wheelbarrow. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow, glazed with rainwater, beside the white chickens. It's a very short, very sparse poem. You note the page, if you look at this on the page, the blankness is actually what dominates rather than the text. And this poem I consider to be a real exemplar of what essays should aim towards when they're trying to be concise. This is a poem in which every single word is contributing to the generation of an image and a narrative. Think about this first phrase, so much depends upon, right? A lot can be contained within that. You can think about, why would anyone care about a red wheelbarrow? Why would anything really depend upon this? Within this, so much is contained. You can think of like a narrative of someone who needs to use the wheelbarrow for their livelihood, to sustain their family. A lot is contained within those few words. And this is a poem in which each word is carefully chosen. So think, for instance, about the word glazed, right? When something is glazed, it's coated with a translucent covering. And you can think about something being glazed with rainwater, not just being wet, but almost shimmering with the surface of water that's upon it. No other word would really do the same job as glazed in this context. All of these words in harmony work to create a very powerful image, I think. And that's the ideal that we should be aiming towards in our essays. So the plan for today's class is to think about a few principles and strategies to make our papers as concise as possible. So the general report writing process, anytime we engage in a research project, looks something like this. Start off by making a plan, doing pre-writing, compose a draft, and then afterwards we rewrite, revise, and edit the draft. Within this revision stage, a lot of different steps actually need to be taken. There are three main things that you want to do as you're entering the revision stage. So after you've created the first draft. The first thing, and this is what revision for conciseness is a part of, is rewriting the paper. This is where you look for places to improve the content, organization, or anything else, where you substantially modify what's in the paper itself. You add things, you cut things, you reorganize things, etc. This is the hardest part of the revision process, but it is in many respects the most important. The second step of revision is very mechanistic. This is the editing phase. And by editing, generally what we mean is trying to improve sentence structure and correcting any grammatical or spelling errors. Anything that's just incorrect, you should try to capture within the editing phase. But you're not really changing anything major about what is in your paper. You're just slightly modifying how exactly it's expressed to make sure that everything follows the rules, the APA style or just English grammar. The last phase we sometimes call proofreading, and this is where you just look for any small errors that you may have missed in the earlier stages. And it's quite amazing how many of these there can be. Minor typos, spelling errors, doubled punctuation, doubled words, extra spaces, etc. These can sometimes slip through the cracks very easily. So it's important to set time aside to just proofread your work before turning it in. Within each of these, there's a different purpose. So the goal of the rewriting phase is to make sure that your takeaway message is actually being conveyed. Within the rewriting, you take the raw material of your draft and you make it into a finished, polished product. In the editing phase, you're not really trying to change the message or the argument, support or evidence or anything like that. You're just trying to refine the mechanics. Proofreading is like the final inspection to make sure everything is exactly as it needs to be and that you haven't introduced new mistakes as you've rewritten your paper. So time should be set aside for each one. Ideally, if you have the time, you would want to do each of these on different days. So the rewriting phase can actually take quite a while. It's the most time-consuming of all of these processes. If you have time, yeah, I guess you could potentially do the editing at the same time. Proofreading, you should really leave aside for an extra day so you can look at the paper with fresh eyes. And this is really, in a sense, what revision as a whole is. It's looking at the paper with a fresh perspective. You can think about the word revision itself as it literally means seeing something again. That's what you're doing when you're revising a work. You're trying to see the text not from the perspective of you, the author, who is in your own head as you were typing things out, who knows exactly what you were trying to say, what you intended to do and argue, what message you thought you were getting across, but instead to see it from the perspective of a reader who doesn't know what was in your head, who doesn't know what your intentions were, who has no choice but to read the text exactly as it is written. And during the revision phase, you're trying to see things from that reader's perspective and make sure that your intentions and goals match the reality of the paper. Now, when we're revising for conciseness, what we're doing is cutting out dead wood from the text. And by that, what I mean is we're getting rid of any unnecessary words, sentences, paragraphs, anything that does not contribute to our main argument or message. You can think of this like in a forest, there's all kinds of dead trees, dead branches on the ground. What we want in our essays is to have only living words, living ideas, to make sure that everything is meaningful, contributing to some part of our project. So there's a few different things that we look for when we're revising for conciseness. One of the first things that we look for is any examples of repetition. Now there's two main ways I think to think about this. The first is whenever we say something more than once unnecessarily. Now, sometimes when we're dealing with very complicated topics, we will need to repeat ourselves a little bit and use a sentence that begins with something like, in other words, or something like, to put this another way. That can be very helpful if we're dealing with a really complicated topic, and we want to make sure that our reader understands. If, on the other hand, we are just stating something that's fairly straightforward and just putting it again in different words several times throughout the paper, we do not want to include that. That's something that is worth cutting out. The other kind of repetition that we can have is when we have words and phrases together that are redundant. Some examples of this would be something like saying that something is red in color or tall in height. Well, it doesn't really make sense to have red be red in anything other than color. If you say something's tall, you don't need to say that it's tall in height. You just say that it's tall. There are all sorts of different ways that this can happen in our papers where we use extra words that are not necessary to get our point across. One of the other ways that we can include too much dead wood in our papers is by including wordy expressions. Now, by wordy expressions, what I mean is collections of words that don't really refer to anything concrete in the world, that don't refer to any sort of abstract idea, that don't really accomplish any task at all. You can think about phrases like, because of the fact that, or the question as to whether. What do these collections of words actually mean? What image do they form in your mind? Earlier in the semester, I spoke about how sentences are like a little play. And in order to understand what's going on in a sentence, you want to think about who are the characters in the play and what are they doing. These are the kinds of sentences or phrases that do not indicate who the characters are, do not indicate what they are doing, and really add nothing but excess words. So whenever possible, look for these expressions and cut them out. The third thing to look out for when revising for conciseness are situations where we use the passive voice. Something that I've mentioned before when thinking about sentence style, but it bears repeating. Passive voice is any time where we're using the sentence form in which the subject is not the one performing the verb, but the one who is receiving the action of the verb. So something like, St. Petersburg was established by Peter the Great, instead of Peter the Great established St. Petersburg. Anytime you have the passive voice, you de-emphasize agency, you de-emphasize the characters that are responsible for performing an action, and you include a whole bunch of unnecessary words. There are some situations where the passive voice can be okay, but most of the time the active voice, where you clearly indicate who the subject is and what they are doing, is much better. The fourth thing to look out for when you're revising for conciseness is any time when you lose focus. And by that I mean where you start talking about something that is not directly related to the actual topic, argument, stance of your paper. Now, the topics that I gave you to think about, and that I know that a lot of you are taking on, are quite broad. Thinking about geoengineering or deterrence or things like that. Unless you keep yourself carefully focused on some narrow topic, it's very easy for this to go off the rails and for you to try to do too much. So, after you've written your first draft, look at your work carefully. Be really rigorous with yourself. Am I staying on topic from the beginning to the end? Is each paragraph actually necessary to prove my argument? Is it actually relevant to the task at hand? Is each sentence within a paragraph connected to the topic sentence? If it's not, it might be something that you need to remove or reorganize in some way. Other things to look for when we're revising for conciseness. Anytime that we are using a progressive or continuous verb tense. These are just different names for the same thing. A continuous verb tense is one that has the form is xing, is running. So it has some conjugation of the verb to be and then some participle. So like, I am walking, we are listening, things like that. That verb tense has a use. It's generally used to indicate something that is happening right now, as in like, I am currently giving a lecture. That's a situation where that verb tense would be appropriate. It's rarely appropriate in written form. It's rare that you will actually be properly using that verb form in an essay. So be on the lookout. If you find yourself having this form where you're saying that something is or are doing something else, you might be using this verb tense, and it might be adding unnecessary clunkiness to your paper. Whenever possible, I encourage you to shift from continuous verb tenses to simple present tenses. So you go from something like the article is indicating to the article indicates, or the author is saying to the author says. It's much clearer, more direct, and it takes up fewer words. The next sort of error that you can look for, or not really an error, but thing that introduces unnecessary words, is when you have excessive use of to be constructions. Sometimes it is necessary to include the phrase to be, the infinitive, but oftentimes it's completely redundant. So for example here, the environment appears to be polluted. What work is to be actually doing here? The subject of this sentence is environment. The verb is appears. What's to be doing here? It doesn't really add anything. Nothing changes if we just say the environment appears polluted. So be careful and look through your paper. See if you can find examples of the infinitive to be. Think really carefully. Does it need to be there? If not, you might want to cut it out. The next thing to look out for are constructions that have the form there is or there are. Sometimes these can be useful, but oftentimes they'll just be taking up unnecessary space. So something like, there are police that disproportionately enforce petty crimes. Well, the there are doesn't really say anything. There are is already implied if we just say police disproportionately enforce. That's already presupposing that there are. So again, look very carefully through your paper. Look for any time you say there is or there are or something like that, and see if you can just cut it out and if it actually changes anything. If it doesn't change anything, then cut it out. Save yourself some words. The last thing that I want you to look out for are unnecessary uses of the first person. Now, I've said before, first person is perfectly appropriate to use in an essay. It's often the most elegant way to say something is in the first person. The times when it can hurt you, make your paper less concise, and make your argument seem less confident is where you add phrases like I think, or I feel, or I believe, something like that. Those sort of phrases are often not necessary. By virtue of the fact that I'm reading your paper, and I know that it's written by you, I know this is what you think. I know that's what you believe. You don't need to add in the extra "I think." The only thing that it does is slightly weaken the confidence in your argument. It's sort of a layer of bracketing. So I'd say try whenever possible to cut those out. Be more straightforward, more confident in your argument. So some general things to do when you're revising your work. The first and most important strategy is to read your work out loud to yourself. By doing that, you put yourself into the context of a reader of your work. You get yourself out of the headspace of being the author, and you force your ears to just listen to what you actually said. If you're reading your work aloud and you stumble over a sentence, you come across something that's just hard to say, you can't really make things flow, that might be a sign that something is wrong with your sentence, that it's written in a clunky way. Maybe you need to break the sentence up, change the way that it's worded, whatever. This is the most important strategy for revising. Take the time, read the work aloud to yourself. The second major strategy for revising your work is to actually take some time away from it. Look at the work with fresh eyes. Have a sleep, have a nap, come back the next day. Now, this isn't always going to be possible, but whenever it is possible, you should do it. I strongly encourage you to try to build in at least a 1-day buffer anytime you have an assignment that's due. So that way you can have take just one final look at it to make sure that it actually makes sense. The third thing to do, if possible, is to try to get feedback from somebody else. If you have a friend who maybe you're working with, or a family member who's willing to take a look at your paper, just ask them if they could do you the favor of taking a look at it and let you know what they think. The goal of this is not generally for them to evaluate whether you are factually correct or to evaluate your argument. Unless they happen to be an expert in whatever topic you're writing about, that's probably not what they're going to be able to help you with. The goal instead is to get a sense of how they feel about what you're reading, about what you've written, rather. If it makes sense, if it sounds good, if it's coherent and clear, those are things they can evaluate about just about anything, even if it's something that they have no real knowledge of. So whenever you can, try to get someone else's point of view on your paper. The last thing that you could do, and it's quite time consuming, but can be quite effective if you set aside time for it, is just look at each sentence and identify the main verb and the subject. This is really helpful because it can make it clear to you that each sentence is actually doing a job, that they actually have a little play that they're staging, that there are actually characters and actions in each sentence. So that's what I encourage you to do over the next few days as you're completing your essay. If you have time for nothing else, read your work aloud. Read it. Listen to the sentences that you're saying and see if they sound okay. Try to make your paper as efficient as possible and make each work count. Okay, so thanks everyone, and I'll talk to you again soon.